Welcome back, everyone. This is the Pinedo Brothers podcast. I got my brother Peter, and I'm JP. We're so glad that you joined us today. Today, we're talking about the best and worst popes of church history. It's going to be a more fun, hopefully lighter episode, although some of this stuff is a little heavy, I suppose. But we want to not take ourselves too seriously, and I think it might be even a shorter episode. Plus, at the end, we'll get to a few, at least one comment that we've had on previous podcasts that really caught our eye. And hopefully you enjoy. So thanks for being here. What do you think, Pete?
Sounds good.
Let's jump right in then. So, Peter, you first. What's your favorite? We're going to hopefully get to two of each for both of us. So, a total of 8 popes total we'll go through, at least in hopes if we start to run out of time, maybe we'll go less. But let's start with you.
hmm
Favorite pope or best pope on your
Yeah.
side?
Well, there's so many. I think there's been like what 400 and something popes, something like that, like an insane amount. But I'm kind of biased here because my name's Peter. So of course, I'm going to say Saint Peter, the first pope, being the best pope, my favorite pope. But I don't want to use that answer because that's kind of like saying George Washington's your favorite president. It's the first is always the best in a lot of people's mind, in many people's minds. So I'll go with a more controversial take. I don't know if I would venture so far as to say he's the best pope of all time, but I think he was a good pope, and I would go with Pope Urban II, who
Hmm,
called
I don't know much
for
about him.
the First Crusade in 1099. The kind of the at the very beginning of the medieval ages. Um, so I think, you know, you can argue back and forth for days on whether or not the Crusades were moral or good. Um, but I think that the fact that this Pope Urban II, saw a need in the Holy Land and a call from the Byzantine Emperor to come help the Christians in the Holy Land who are being overrun by Muslim forces. And obviously that's simplifying the whole story. But I think that it took a lot of integrity and moral courage for him to actually some, put out the call and to call the Christians of Europe to take a stand for the Holy Land. Um, I think that's pretty awesome. I think it's something that it would be great to see more of. I'm not saying we want to see calls to violence, but we want to see calls to stand up for the faith. And I think that's something that Pope Urban can definitely teach us today. What do you think?
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I mean, he was like we can't even put it into perspective like that what he was able to accomplish with his call to go on this crusade. I mean, it was a non uh, a significant percentage of the male population in the crusades just got up and went across the world, and he called at his call they did that. Now we our modern day popes can barely get a significant portion of the male population to follow them on Twitter, like much less go and on a crusade. And it has nothing against our modern day popes at all. It's a completely different time, but it's hard to put that in perspective, that type of impact that the pope had. What was it? I think the first crusade was something like 200,000 men. Was that right? Something like
I
that
don't.
went on.
I couldn't give you the exact numbers because it's medieval numbers, so
Right.
you never
That's a
know.
good point. That's a very good point. So it was insane. But I mean, on top of that too, a pope that was actually connected to his flock and connected to the time that he lived in. He wasn't up in
Mhm.
the ivory tower like some of the popes that we'll talk about in the future. I mean, he saw a huge issue that was happening where the Church of the East was being overrun, just being complete shambles because the whirlwind in the desert was just overtaking everything. And so he responded to that heroically and called out many other heroes to come forward and respond to that. So
Mhm.
definitely a great pope.
Yeah,
Um,
and I think history is shaping Pope too,
mm,
and for the good too, because prior to the First Crusade, prior to the 1000s into the 1100s, moving on to the high medieval ages, um, Europe was behind. It was behind the Middle East. It was behind Asia in terms of technology and in a lot of different ways. Um, but the Crusade really ushered in like a whole new era, and in all of it, it was all advanced scientific advancements, learning advancements, philosophy, all of that art in it. But the central core piece of it was, I think, Urban's message that we want to advance and we want to move forward in the name of Christ, Deus Vult. And so that's what set apart the medieval ages in Europe, is that they're making these incredible advances, all for the purpose of glorifying God. Um, Obviously, not everyone was good, but that's the central core idea of what medieval identity was, and I think that Pope Urban II played a big, huge part in that.
love it. Okay. Well, great start, Pete. Okay, to move on to my first.
Yeah,
Okay. I want to jump forward about 1,000 years, not quite, because like I said, can't be in this millennium. So we're going to block out anyone that's actually a full 1,000 years later. But born in 1920, my best Pope pick has to start with Pope St. John Paul the Great, Karawotiwa. Um, Now, many of the people that are listeners will also remember this is the first Pope. We grew up with this Pope, really. And his call to be not afraid and his rejoicing in the new evangelization really inspired how I create art, how I look at the world, has been instrumentally shaped by Pope John Paul II. Um, and it's also amazing to me how so many things conspired to try to stop him from even growing to full like manhood, to full adulthood, from becoming a priest. And yet nothing could stop God's will. It was amazing. This guy, I know a lot of our listeners are going to know all about Pope St. John Paul II. So I'll be brief, just speaking about some of the things that I love so much about him. Um, he was living in war-torn Poland during the Nazi occupation, and then after the Nazis left, they had the even or equally as bad and brutal communists just continue to tear the place even more apart. And during this time, he was working in a quarry, uh, breaking and moving bricks. And he was run over by a truck, I think 3 times, 2 or 3 times, as he's on his way to the quarry and considering the priesthood. But he was also a great playwright and director who just understood the arts. And you see that carried over as he decides to become a priest and goes off and studies in the seminary and brings this love of the art, and then becomes a bishop, becomes a cardinal, and then elevated to pope finally, where he served. He was one of the youngest popes. He served as pope from 1978 to 2005, and really shaped the world. He came in while the communist regime, you talk about people that affected history, he came in while the communist regime was alive and well and just terrorizing vast swaths of the world. By the time he was done, it was in the dustbin. It was done. Talk about someone who saw real change. Like that's what I call winning the war. And Pope John Paul II was one of the most major players in how he dedicated Russia. He took the message of um, of Fatima, Our Lady of Fatima, and dedicated Russia to Our Lady, and the rest really became history. But as an artist, I wanted to say, check out his letter for artists. If any aspiring artists are out there, I keep it on my desk. Let's see. I keep it right here. and it just completely inspires everything that I do. It's dedicated to all who are passionately dedicated to the search for new epiphanies of beauty, so that through their creative work as artists, they may offer these as gifts to the world. Written in 1999. So he would be top of my list. I know that's a bit cheating because everyone knows about Pope John Paul II,
Mm.
but hopefully there was a few things that came through that are helpful to our artists, to
Yeah.
other listeners.
Yeah, he's definitely a true artist, and it comes through, like you said, in all his works. That letter especially, but also all the other letters and books
Oh
and
yes.
writings that he did. Um, yeah, you can definitely tell. Just and also the way that he approached his pontificate, I think it was if you wanted to know what would it look like for an artist to lead the Catholic Church, I think Pope St. John Paul II really showed that very beautifully. Um, a recommendation for any Catholics go to who come to DC, a must see for Catholics in DC is the John Paul II National Shrine um, here in DC, right off the campus of Catholic University of America. It's this massive shrine, very beautiful. It's very modern, so it's not like a very traditional looking church or anything, but it's beautiful in its own way. But it has this amazing, really awesome museum, basically on the life and works of John Paul II, and it's very moving to see the impact that he had, and uh, and how much he internalized the Gospels. I think. He has a message that resounds not just with Catholics, but of anyone, especially anyone who's artistically oriented,
Hmm.
though.
Speaking of being moved, I also found out recently that I've felt often a kindred spirit with Pope Saint John Paul the Great. Not just because we have the same initials,
Mhm.
and I'm the second, and JP the second, and JP. I but also I didn't know this, but the doctors told his mom or encouraged her to abort him because of illnesses that were going on when, in his mother, and they thought the baby wouldn't be healthy either. And that was something that doctors considered, counseled our parents for me as well, because I was a chance that I would be Down syndrome. So obviously, far cry from Pope St. John Paul the Great, but I've always felt a kindred spirit. So anyway,
Mhm.
Peter, what's your second number two? What's your
Sec-
second great one?
Second favorite,
Yeah,
another
second
favorite.
favorite, or another best, another top two.
Well, I have to say, that his name is escaping me quite at the moment right now. But the Pope during World War II, what was his name?
That's Pope Pius the 12th.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, I think we have a lot of mixed media. He gets a lot of mixed media coverage these days, a lot of good and a lot of bad. But I think if you really take a moment or take some time to research what he did, he was an incredibly heroic and brave pope as well. Um, Obviously, not a military leader or not a leader of a powerful nation, but a faith leader who was willing to defy the fascist and world powerful forces that were completely surrounding him at the time. He saved many lives, many Jewish lives. So I think there's a lot to be said for someone who can be, literally surrounded by Hitler and still defy Hitler at the same time. And he didn't have the the freedom to just straight up, and protest. He didn't have the freedom to protest Hitler. He had to fight against Hitler in a way that would actually save lives. Does that make sense? Because
Mhm.
you can morally grandstand and be like, this is not right, but then you can also do things to actually make a difference. And I think that's what he was more focused on doing. And so that's where I think he gets a lot of his criticism, but at the same time, he did so much.
Yeah, he's been. terribly slandered. He's a true hero that saved thousands of Jewish people. He constantly was pushing back and fighting at both Hitler and Stalin and refuting their claims. That there's a great quote that I saw. Um, Even so, the Nazis were not like in the 30s. The Nazis were actually, people liked them in the West, especially in the U.S. Like the progressives in the U.S. really liked the Nazis, and the Pope was onto it from the jump. He called them miserable plagiarists who dress up old errors with new tinsel, and that's in 1935. So he saw them from the very beginning as the true horrors, like the capable of the true horrors that they went on to do. And he fought them every step of the way. It's a grievous rewriting of history to say anything different. And even great movies that we like quite a bit, like Started in the Black, with Gregory Peck, really get this one wrong. I don't know. Why do you think so many people get this wrong, though?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely a current, definitely among historians, but I think amongst the culture as well, to want to see the church as the bad guys. To want to see the Pope, to be very quick to believe that the Pope is, behind this network of big evil, world powers. I think that's a very common thread, especially in America, because we do have that remaining, British, that thing, the papism that we've gotten from our British heritage as a nation. So I've kind of placed blame partly on that. Um, but again, like what I was saying, he did um, live in a very difficult time that required a lot of diplomacy. And I think we tend to see things as very black and white. You either were fighting, you storming Berlin, or you were for Berlin. It's one or the other. You can't. There's no shades in which you can understand that actually there's certain people and certain times that required uh, more difficult choices and more difficult, more heroic types of witness, which I think he was able to do. Does that make sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. He was a hero, and he put his person, like he would hide Jews on his own like his own family farms, his own property, just trying to save as many people as he could.
Hmm.
So he put
Which I
himself on
think,
the line.
yeah, just as a side note, I think the church just recently beatified a whole family. Did you hear about that?
I didn't. Tell me more.
Yeah, so this church, I forget what their names were. I could look it up in a little while. Um, but the church just beatified an entire family, including a pregnant woman. So you could make an argument that an unborn baby has been beatified, because this whole family, I think they were a husband and wife and 9 kids, who were executed by the Nazis because they were found to be hiding Jewish families in their home, and the father refused to give up. He was offered, kind of like in what's that movie where they're offered, like the dad makes the choice,
You're
give
talking
up the Jew.
about the Inglorious Bastards
Yeah,
flick.
yeah, that one. Yeah. So like that situation, except the dad doesn't. He refuses to give up the Jews that he's hiding, and so they were all killed by the Nazis. So it's an inspiring story. You want to look that up too.
Wow, wow, yeah. I'll have to look that up. That's great. Okay, moving on, shall we?
Yeah.
Okay, so
You're-
my pick number two for favorite pope or best pope. This is choosing from many, many. So this is we could easily do a top 10 or top 20, and wouldn't be exhausting the choices for best pope. But we have to choose. So here we go. Pope Pius V. He was born in 1504, died in 1572. He was elevated to pope in 1566. And so he was the one that oversaw the great battle of Lepanto, which Peter and I have talked about in the past, where Don Juan of Austria led the united forces of Christendom in a last-ditch effort to save the church and save all of Western civilization from the hordes of Muslims that were just across the pond and had an invincible armada waiting to burn everything to the ground that was not of the Muslim faith. So definitely a pope that was in desperate times. And we think as this time as being the darkest and most desperate that we've ever had, but it's useful to look back to a time when there was really, like, the other popes have had this, like Pope Leo the Great is another great example, but Pope Pius, people, like, the smart money was that the church wasn't going to survive the next decade. The church, there would be no stone on top of another in Rome, and yet the church survived. The gates of hell are not able to overcome. Something a little bit more about this. So he was elected in 1566 to take the name of Pius, becoming the fourth to take that name. His nephew was also a saint. I'm sorry, the prior pope's nephew was also a saint, Charles Borromeo, who advocated that Pope Pius become elected, and really helped him take the reins and become the Pope Pius that we look back in history. He worked to combat the growing swath of Protestantism, put the kibosh on extravagant spending in the court, which you're going to hear about more when we talk about worst popes. Wore a hair shirt beneath his clothes. So talk about being someone who lived poverty. Imagine a pope wearing a hair shirt. Was beatified in 1672. So, any case, that's a little bit about Pope Pius V. Oh, one other thing. Besides inspiring the whole world to, or not the whole world, but besides inspiring Christendom to do a desperate last-ditch attempt to fight against the armada of Moors that were coming across, he also inspired the Rosary Crusade, which all of Europe was just praying the Rosary as the Battle of Lepanto was waging. And he himself was kneeling and praying for that whole time, saying the Rosary. So you can really attribute what the Catholics have to this day, which is a great respect and veneration of the Rosary, to Pope Pius IV. So, I'm sorry, Pope Pius V.
Yeah. He really showed the effectiveness of prayer. I think it's something that you can actually, like, historically point towards and see the miraculous power of the Rosary. It's been a tool for, I think, incredible good by the effect that it's actually had on history with the Battle of Lepanto. And I think for decades now, the Rosary has been the weapon of pro-lifers fighting against the evil of abortion today. But of many different evils. I think the feast day is coming up, right? Our Lady of the Rosary.
Yes, it is of Lepanto,
Yes,
October 7th.
yeah,
October 7th.
So in a couple of days here, we'll be celebrating the victory at the Battle of Lepanto. So I'm glad you brought it up now, because it's an inspiring story, and I think just the power of prayers really showed in that pope in
Absolutely.
particular.
And just to clarify, I think I might have said wrong earlier. It's Pope Pius V that we're speaking of. Pope Pius V. All right. Now that we've started off with the great stories and the great ones, let's talk about the not so great. Peter, what's your first of the worst?
Yeah. Well, it's probably going to be similar to something you would say. I think everyone can agree the Borgia popes were quite a blot on the Catholic Church. I think there was a couple of them. I know Pope Alexander VI was one of
He
them.
was on my list. He was
Okay.
on my list. Go
Yeah.
ahead. Tell us about
Yeah.
Pope Alexander VI.
Well, just
I shouldn't be smiling, but it's so bad.
just an unmitigated disaster on every single front. I guess the one front where it's not a complete mitigated disaster is he never taught heresy from the chair of St. Peter from ex cathedras, but
Which
obviously he
is,
lived.
which is a common theme, though. Even these the worst popes didn't do that. Somehow, some Holy Spirit was out there stopping that from happening. Go ahead.
Mhm. Yeah. But unfortunately, for the whole world and for Catholicism in particular and Christianity, he lived out heresy.
Hmm.
His life was if you think of the way you live as a form of preaching, definitely preached heresy in the way he lived.
Yeah.
A lot of sexual immorality, a lot of nepotism, a lot of corruption. And this, I think, was a big, huge part of what pushed people away from the Catholic Church and towards something, the various different sects of
Yeah,
Protestantism.
this is he became pope in 1492. Easy to
Mhm.
remember. When Columbus was sailing the ocean blue,
Yeah,
he became pope. Yeah, Rodrigo Borgia was his name, and he took the name of Alexander the Sixth. Go ahead.
yeah, yeah. Well, it's unfortunate too because Spain has been such an incredible Catholic country, but here it contributed. Yeah, in my mind, if not the worst, definitely one of the worst popes in history.
Mm.
Um, every any possible thing that you could think of that would be scandalous and shocking for a pope to do and have happening, you would find in this guy. Uh, Having affairs as the pope and having illegitimate sons and then actually appointing them to church positions, terrible. Like so, I think if you're ever feeling down about where we're at right now in the church, I think you can at least say, well, it has been worse. Um,
Yeah. But another thing to remember too, though, there's always two sides of every story. He was a Spanish pope, like you said. He was from Spain, and remember, Rome is in Italy. It was back then. So, and he had many enemies. So a lot of the accounts that were written about him were embellished. There was plenty bad that he did, that's for sure. But then there's a lot of stuff that was written by Italians who hated the Spanish, and so it kind of it all has to be taken with somewhat of a grain of salt. But
mm,
yes, he was terrible, definitely bad. But I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut in. Sorry.
yeah, yeah. I think and there ended up being another one, right? He was nephew or something like that.
Well, let's see. There was a couple of popes, yes, that were of the Borgia line. His son, so this Pope Alexander the Sixth fathered an illegitimate child, Cesare, who was definitely bad. He got appointed into different areas of the church and was even worse than his father. But in any case, he did not preach any error, like you said, and he supposedly, it's reported, had a great conversion at the end of his life. Reportedly made a final confession. Um, so he might be in purgatory now, or maybe he's actually made it. Who knows? Like we can't. It's another what we were talking about the last podcast. We shouldn't condemn anyone to hell. A pope like this, the higher you are in the hierarchy, the more you have to answer for, and so he has a lot to answer for. Um, but my goodness, uh, maybe he's not in hell. Who knows? So anyway, that was one that was on my list for sure, but it's okay. I had a backup in case you took one of those. But he's a great terrible one. So I had on also on my list was Pope Benedict the Ninth. He became Pope three different times.
Mm, mhm,
Um, his first time he was Pope was in 1032. And then he got kicked out because of his habits of immorality or a lot of different bad stuff that he would do, just all sorts of things that he would do in the churches and in the Lateran Palace. So the Church of St. John Lateran, or the popes, there wasn't St. Peter's there yet, I believe, but it was just in these places that are meant to be holy, he was doing very bad things. I mean, he actually wasn't even a priest. He was one of the lay people that was elevated to a pope. There's no actual ever since he was the last lay person that's been elevated to a pope, but
mm,
there isn't a rule or a law prior to here that demanded that someone be a priest or a bishop. to become pope, and he had unlimited money, unlimited power, and was able to use it. But he got kicked out by a crowd of people that just got tired of his immorality in 1044. Then he managed to regroup and come back, um, with an army, and made himself pope again in 1045. Um, though he did pay $20 million in today's equivalent money in order to become pope again, for to pay off the armies that he had under him, and then he was driven out again. I think this time on charges of simony, and managed to regroup and come back in 1047, becoming pope. Oh wait, he resigned the second time and managed to come back in 1047, saying he got bored and wanted to come back. And finally, they drove him off for good in 1048. So he had three different reigns as pope: 1032 to 1044, 1 year in 1045, and then 1047 through 1048, which actually is one of the times of history where incredible things were happening in Christendom, which goes to show it doesn't matter how bad the Pope is, as long as you're committed to living your faith and you build your community up. This is when Chartres Cathedral was going up, when all this terrible stuff was happening. So if we remember that the little people working in the church and living out our faith to a radical degree, it doesn't matter how terrible the Pope may or may not be. I mean, obviously, we'd prefer if we had the JP2 up there, but it doesn't matter. You just live your faith and you can accomplish great things. So it's a good thing to remember with this guy. He was definitely not a good guy, Pope Benedict IX, but it's a good lesson for us. Anyway, on to you, Pete.
Are we doing another bad one?
Yeah, another bad one.
Oh man, I don't know if I have another bad one. I just think of the Borgia. I would say the other the other Borgia.
Okay, the hypothetical other bad one. Okay, how about we go back to my one other bad one, and then we can. He's not nearly as interesting as the guy we just spoke about, but he's one of the Medici popes, which was a pope pretty close to the Borgia pope, actually. 1513 to 1521 is when he was pope. So really, we had some really bad ones. I think he was number 5 of the bad 8 popes that we had. We had like this range of like 8 terrible popes and became known as the 8 bad popes. And I think he was number 5. He took the this throne of pope at age 38. And actually, he was not a priest yet. He was a member of the clergy, but he was a deacon and hadn't actually been made a priest. The Medici family, like I said, had incredible power, and so that was really what caused this 38-year-old deacon to be able to become pope. He borrowed and spent money like nobody's business. I guess maybe it was a good thing for us to say he was a patron of the arts, but he just spent it all just trying to get more lavish and crazy. He really, like, more than I think your Borgia Pope, caused the Protestant revolt more than anyone. While he's out spending money like nobody's business, Luther is out saying, hey, we need to reform. And if we had actually had a decent pope at the time, maybe it would not have been as bad. But he's really seen as the last straw to help spark this great Protestant revolt. And Pope Leo X, God works in mysterious ways, and God is going to use this great split that we've had back then in the 1500s. But if you want to understand maybe why the Protestants are still to this day look at us as as Catholics is spending too much money in our churches, and um, putting extravagant um, use into our liturgies. You can think back to what Luther saw with Pope Leo X, of this guy spending. It said that he spent all of the money of the pope that came before, all of the money for him, and then all of the money for the pope that came right after him, Pope Leo X.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so, and this one, unfortunately, he died without receiving the last sacrament. So we don't have even that nicer story to talk about with the Borgia Pope. Um, so the Medici family, the Medici crime family, and their Giovanni de Medici's son, definitely is a sad story. But in any
Yeah.
case, it's a good reminder, like I said, that we're still here, and the church has been reformed in this since then, and we're in constant need for further reform. So, as the lay, as the church militant, as us, the laity within this church, let us go out and live our faith radically and create the reform that's needed in our own lives, because it has our actions matter. So, Peter, any last thoughts on this Medici Pope?
Well, I couldn't agree more. I think that there's a call for sainthood to be expressed in our own individual lives and communities, and the scandals that may or may not be happening in the church at any one point in time in history uh, don't change that call that we from God. So I think it's a good point.
Great. Okay. Well, I wanted to get into a comment, and then I think maybe we do a quick take on something current in the art world that's going on. So our previous podcast, we had a great comment from Nathaniel Jamie Donahue, 1892. Fascinating discussion. I feel as though y'all were dropping potential tangential access points all throughout the show. I can't be sure which line to tug at. I'll stick just a couple. My cursory thought of the purpose of guilt is that God, being love, wishes to be loved by his creation, and in so doing gave us free will so that we might have that capacity. Knowing our shortcoming, however, he gives us our conscience in order to aid in directing our choices toward good and seek reconciliation following a wrong, sinful choice. The devil then seeks to influence us with deception and confusion in the form of temptation. Finally, I think guilt would be an umbrella term to cover the sensation we experience when we struggle to determine what we have done or neglected to do, as to do was the path of righteousness or folly. I absolutely agree, and I love the image that you have here of the. I thought of it as the Jiminy Cricket, the that little voice of conscience, that Pinocchio does so well, those brilliant story makers that made Pinocchio. And that's really the image that I see for us here, is needing to harken back to those old symbols that, obviously we can't do what Disney did. It's a different time, but we need to harken back to those same old symbols, because those are still relevant, and that image of that conscience being our guide is so strong and so potent. It just needs to be updated for new stories. Your thoughts on that first point?
Yeah, I agree too. It's we always tend to see guilt as in the negative sense, but I think like he's Nathaniel's and Jamie are saying there, it's there's another side of it. There's a side it's a calling, and that's what we kind of spoke to. But yeah, that imagery kind of just it adds to that.
Absolutely. Okay, he goes on. The discussion of hell is so complex, so I do not pretend to have any specific knowledge or comprehension of this dogma. The way I try to understand what hell is, and therefore how God can justly condemn souls there, is that hell is simply where God is not. This is simple to understand regarding clearly horrific acts of injustice, murder, defiant apostasy from the church, and directly cursing God. But this is less clear when it comes to examples of an individual who, in good faith, just does not see a need to seek Christ and follow him, or those who perhaps never were introduced to him in their lives at all. For these latter examples, I rely in Christ's mercy that hell will be a naturally perfect eternal state, but lacking the beatific vision, a neutral state of condemnation. rather than active punishment for those who knew better and rejected God outright. I know there's a lot that can be impacted in my understanding here, but this is a start. Okay. So when I read that, I immediately think to C.S. Lewis with The Last Battle, where C.S. Lewis pictures heaven as he calls it an onion, where it keeps on one layer after another, just keeps getting better and better and better. And this is something that's Catholic doctrine too, is like as you live your life and gain eternal salvation, you also are closer to the beatific vision as you lived your life heroically and lived your faith heroically. And so I think you can apply that on the negative sense, just like Dante did with his
Mhm.
seven circles of hell, as he saw like the worst, the most terrible part of hell would be those reserved for the traitors. And I think you're exactly right that those that are given much are expected more. That's a very biblically centered perspective. So if you are given the fullness of the truth and yet still reject God, the uh, despair and anguish which you feel eternally because of that action will be greater. You have more knowledge. So therefore, it follows that your hell will be an even more tormented place.
Mm.
With those that are given less, will receive much less punishment. And I also think, too, you can follow God with natural law, just like the natural law, the teaching of natural law that we have as Catholics, which is written on all our hearts. So if you try to live that good and follow it, you are following, even without any knowledge of Christ, following Christ. So that I have to believe, and I think the church backs it up. It's the baptism by desire doctrine, which will merit you salvation in the end because you are following that law which God has written on your heart. Um, so even without knowing it, you're following Christ. But what are your thoughts, Pete?
Yeah, I'm not sure I fully understood what they were saying there. It seemed to me that they were saying, and maybe they can comment and let me know if I'm misunderstanding what they're saying. That there's, I guess, a level of hell, if you want to think in terms of Dante's levels, where it's not really so much suffering, but more just like removal or deprivation from God. And that's for the people who, through no fault of their own, could not choose God, which I mean, I think you were disagreeing with as well. Um, but yeah,
Well, I wasn't outrightly disagreeing. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I do think that it's hard to communicate with just what is written. So I think I'm saying yes and then maybe my and is a bit of a twist. They'll definitely correct me, I'm sure, in the comments. But sorry, I'm so sorry. Keep going.
yeah, no, we definitely could be misunderstanding, but I think they probably would agree. I know I'm sure they've read C.S. Lewis and all that, and how I think there was that one noble warrior from the bad guys side who came in and he had no knowledge of
Aslan.
Aslan or anyone.
Mhm.
And I think that's like a beautiful kind of way to look at it. Again, obviously, none of us have died, so we don't really have any real knowledge other than what the church can teach us and what theologians have theorized.
Mhm.
Um, but I think again, like it's all dependent on God's mercy when it comes to things like this.
Mhm. Absolutely. Okay. Well, I hope we did justice to your comment. That was an excellent one and very thought provoking. So thank you. All
Hmm.
right. Moving on to a quick take on what's going on in the art world around us. This is tangential to the art world, but still, there's trending on Twitter. Oh, Taylor Swift, who I actually used to really love her music. Um, I talked about it in a podcast before. Peter, you and I were doing one together. We did a podcast called Poets and Lunatics, where we talked a lot about right on that when I started to perceive that Taylor Swift's music was going off the rails a little bit. So I think that would probably be back in 2016 or something like that. But prior to then, I really thought she was onto something. Um, Now I think all her music is sadly the same. However, there is she's trending on Twitter because she's dating a Kansas City Chiefs one of the Kansas City Chiefs, and it's I think they're struggling now, and so everyone's blaming Taylor Swift. They're always blame the girlfriends. It's so terrible. But in any case, what is your thoughts on this T Swift trending?
Yeah, I just think it's hilarious because Taylor Swift has become such a cultural just icon in a way, that you can't ignore her. It's incredible. Really, they even call it the Taylor Swift effect. Like the last few couple NFL games that the Chiefs, the last couple of Chiefs games, the tickets have gone up way up in sales. Like she's actually impacting the NFL's ticket sales by just by going to her boyfriend's game, which
She
is,
needs to start dating someone on the Oakland A's. Those poor
yeah,
Oakland
maybe
A's.
we can save the A's. Um,
That's the solution.
yeah. See if someone can arrange that.
Yeah.
That's what you need to be doing in Oakland. Um, but I think it's relevant because I think there's a couple each generation of cultural icons that really arise for each generation. You had like the Beatles, you had Elvis, people like that who are really huge, huge parts of what the identity for that generation is. And I think Taylor Swift definitely, you can very easily make a case for her being something like that for this generation, just because of the extent of the influence that she has through the work that she does. Um, and so I think parts of that are good and parts of that are bad, because some of her music's really great. I have to disagree with you in terms of her great music because I think 2020 was her best album. Um, she made two albums in there. Both of those are my favorites. Good stuff. But also she has a lot of really weird, like really are boring kind of candy pop that also is very popular. And so I think that speaks really well to this generation. It has
Mm.
moments of true depth and beauty where it's really searching for something, and then moments where it's totally turning completely away from that and choosing shallowness and choosing uh, destructive, self-destructive tendencies. Um, and so I think, yeah, you can kind of point to that as being very indicative of the culture that we live in, um, both the good and the bad. So it's interesting.
Mm. Hey, send me a couple of those songs that you think I've missed in 2020 that you think are her best, would you? I
Mhm.
want to reassess. I'm pretty sure I've listed all of them, but I want to make sure I didn't needlessly disparage poor T Swift. I'm sure she's heartbroken over
Yeah,
that.
very sad.
All right. Any case, thanks for the quick take. And thank you all for joining us. I really do appreciate the thoughts, and I hope you leave a lot of comments so we can continue to chat about all of this great stuff. And Peter, thank you so much for the conversation. We'll talk soon, huh?
Okay, thank you.
All right. God bless all.